The winter of 1878 proved unusually harsh in Sweetwater Valley, Wyoming, where Abigail Turner sat alone by the window of her father's general store, watching snowflakes dance across the desolate Main Street while ignoring the whispers that always followed her like persistent shadows through the small frontier town. At 23, Abigail had grown accustomed to the sideways glances and hushed comments about her size, the way women pulled their children closer when she passed, as though her considerable weight might somehow be contagious. "Abigail," her father called from the back room. "The delivery from Cheyenne's coming tomorrow. Need you to make space in the storeroom." "Yes, Pa," she answered, rising from her seat with practiced care. The wooden chair creaked in relief, a sound Abigail pretended not to notice as she made her way to the storeroom. James Turner was a practical man who had raised Abigail alone since her mother died of typhoid when she was just 8 years old. He loved his daughter fiercely, but couldn't shield her from the cruelties of the world, particularly in a place like Sweetwater where people had little to do besides work and gossip. Abigail organized sacks of flour and sugar, rearranging barrels to make room for the new supplies. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the chill in the air. Physical labor always came with extra effort for her, but she'd learned to pace herself, to work steadily and efficiently despite her breathing coming harder than it did for others. The bell above the shop door jangled and she heard her father greet a customer. Abigail continued her work, knowing most folks preferred not to deal with her if they could help it. "Turner," a gruff voice said, "need some supplies. Heading north to break new horses before spring comes." "Elliott," her father responded. "Heard you'd taken that contract with the Army. Quite the opportunity for a man your age." Abigail's ears perked up. She knew of Ethan Elliott only by reputation, a horse trainer known for having a way with even the wildest Mustangs, who'd arrived in the territory 2 years earlier. At 30, he was already building a name for himself, though she'd never actually met him. Curiosity got the better of her, and Abigail peered around the storeroom door. The man standing at the counter was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his sheepskin coat. His face was all angles, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. "Need coffee, bacon, beans," he was saying, "enough to last a month or so. Some sugar, too, if you've got it." "Abigail," her father called, "bring out a 10-pound sack of sugar from the back, would you?" She hesitated, then steeled herself. This was her father's store as much as his, and she had every right to be there. Still, she smoothed her apron over her substantial middle before emerging, keeping her eyes down as she carried the sugar to the counter. When she set it down, she glanced up to find Ethan Elliott studying her with unabashed curiosity. His eyes were a startling blue, clear as mountain lakes against his tanned skin. "Thank you, miss," he said simply, with a slight nod. No mockery in his voice, no poorly disguised disgust, just a straightforward acknowledgement. Abigail found herself momentarily flustered. "You're welcome, Mr. Elliott," she replied softly. Something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, that she knew his name before he turned back to her father to continue their transaction. "You'll need coffee," her father was saying. "Just got some in fresh last week." Abigail retreated to the storeroom, but not before she heard Ethan ask, "Your daughter?" "Yes," her father replied, pride evident in his voice. "Smartest person in Sweetwater and the best hand I have." A flush crept up her neck at the compliment. James Turner might be gruff and practical, but he'd never been ashamed of her. It was one of the few constants in her life. As she continued organizing the storeroom, Abigail tried not to think about the way Ethan Elliott's gaze had settled on her without the usual revulsion. It meant nothing, she told herself. He was just being polite, and tomorrow he'd ride north to the army outpost, and that would be that. Later that evening, after closing the store, Abigail sat at their small kitchen table while her father smoked his pipe. "Elliott seems to be doing well for himself," James commented. "Heard the army's paying him good money to break those new mounts." "That's nice," Abigail replied noncommittally, focusing on her mending. "Single man," her father continued, a bit too casually. "About time he settled down, I'd imagine." Abigail's hand stilled. "Pa, don't," James raised his eyebrows. "Don't what?" "You know perfectly well what. I'm not looking for a husband, and even if I were, no man in his right mind would." She stopped, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I'm content as I am," her father sighed, setting his pipe aside. "You shouldn't say such things, Abby. You've got more to offer than any girl in this territory." Abigail gave him a sad smile. "We both know that's not how the world works, Pa." She'd long ago accepted her fate. In a harsh frontier where survival often depended on physical strength and endurance, where women were valued for their ability to bear children and work the land, Abigail knew her prospects were non-existent. Men sought wives who could work alongside them, bear healthy children, and bring beauty to their harsh lives. She offered none of these things, not in the way people expected. At 23, she was firmly on the shelf, and that was that. She had her father, the store, and her books. It would have to be enough. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Abigail rose early to stoke the fire in the small house behind the store before heading out to open for the day. The snow had stopped, leaving Sweetwater buried under a pristine white blanket. She was sweeping the boardwalk when she spotted a rider approaching from the south end of town. Even at a distance, she recognized Ethan Elliott's broad shoulders and the distinctive paint horse he rode. He wasn't due to leave until later, after the supply wagon arrived. To her surprise, he reined in his horse directly in front of the store. "Morning, Miss Turner," he called, tipping his hat. "Store open yet?" "Just about," she answered, clutching the broom handle. "Did you forget something yesterday?" "Not exactly." He swung down from his saddle with the easy grace of a man who spent most of his life on horseback. "Just thought of something else I might need." Abigail nodded and led the way inside, lighting the lamps against the early morning gloom. "What can I help you with, Mr. Elliott?" He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly from being pressed beneath it. "Thought I might need some proper writing paper and ink. Army captain's particular about his reports." It seemed a flimsy excuse. Paper and ink weren't typically high on a cowboy's list of necessities, but Abigail didn't question him. "We keep stationery over here," she said, leading him to a small display near the counter. As she showed him the various options, she became acutely aware of his proximity. Most men kept their distance from her, as though her size might somehow infringe upon their own space. Ethan stood close enough that she could smell leather and would smoke on him. "You know," he said casually as he examined a pot of ink, "I heard you've got quite the collection of books." Abigail looked up in surprise. "Where did you hear that?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Small town. People talk." "People certainly do," she agreed, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. His blue eyes met hers directly. "I didn't mean gossip, Miss Turner. Your father mentioned it when I asked about you." The simple admission made her flush. "My father talks too much." "I find most fathers do when it comes to their daughters." His smile broadened. "I'm fond of reading myself, though opportunities are scarce on the trail." "What do you like to read?" The question slipped out before she could stop herself. "History, mostly. Some poetry when I can get it." He set the ink pot down. "And you?" "Everything," she admitted. "I prefer novels, but I'll read anything I can get my hands on." For the next several minutes they discussed books Dickens and Twain, Whitman's poems and Shakespeare's plays. Ethan spoke with genuine enthusiasm, revealing an education Abigail hadn't expected from a horse trainer. "Most people around here don't have much use for reading," she observed. "Most people around here are missing out," he replied simply. The conversation flowed easily until the bell above the door jangled, announcing another customer. Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife, entered with her perpetual air of disapproval. "Good morning, Abigail," she said stiffly, before turning a much warmer smile toward Ethan. "Mr. Elliott, what a pleasant surprise. I thought you'd be on your way north by now." "Heading out after the supply wagon arrives, madam," he replied politely. Mrs. Peterson's eyes darted between them, clearly calculating what business Ethan might have with Abigail. "Well, don't let me interrupt," she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. "I just need to pick up some thread." As she moved to another part of the store, Ethan lowered his voice. "I should get back to preparing for the journey." "Of course," Abigail replied, equally quiet. "Will you be taking the paper and ink?" He looked down at the items he'd barely examined. "Yes, I suppose I will." After he paid and left, Mrs. Peterson wasted no time approaching the counter. "Such a handsome young man," she said with practiced casualness. "Quite the catch for some lucky girl, I imagine." Abigail kept her expression neutral. "Was there anything else you needed today, Mrs. Peterson?" The older woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, dear, just the thread." She placed her coins on the counter. "Though I would caution you not to read too much into a man's politeness. It can lead to misunderstandings." "I assure you there's no misunderstanding on my part," Abigail replied evenly, though her cheeks burned. "Mr. Elliott is a customer, nothing more, Mrs." Peterson patted her hand with false sympathy. "Of course, dear, it's just that when a girl in your situation might misconstrue simple kindness." Abigail bit back a sharp retort. "Your thread, Mrs. Peterson," she said instead, handing over the purchase. "Have a pleasant day." After the woman left, Abigail pressed her palms against her eyes, willing away the sting of tears. This was precisely why she avoided unnecessary interactions. People always assumed the worst, always believed she was desperate for male attention because of her size. One simple conversation with Ethan Elliott, and already the gossip would be spreading through town. The supply wagon arrived shortly before noon, and Abigail busied herself with inventory while her father handled the delivery. She deliberately stayed in the back, avoiding any chance encounter with Ethan, who would surely come to collect his supplies before departing. She was counting sacks of beans when her father called for her. "Abby, need your help out here." With reluctance, she emerged to find the store empty except for her father and Ethan, who stood beside a formidable pile of supplies. "Mr. Elliott needs help organizing his provisions," James explained. "I've got to ride over to the Johnson place. Their youngest has taken ill, and Sarah needs medicine." Abigail nodded, understanding the urgency. The Johnsons lived several miles outside town, and with a sick child, the medicine couldn't wait. "You'll be all right managing things?" her father asked, already pulling on his heavy coat. "Of course," she assured him, though her stomach knotted at the prospect of being alone with Ethan. After her father left, an awkward silence fell between them. Ethan cleared his throat. "I appreciate the help, Miss Turner. Need to pack everything properly to survive the journey." "How long will you be at the outpost?" she asked, focusing on the task of sorting the supplies into appropriate bundles. "Month, maybe two," he answered, working alongside her. "Depends on how quickly the horses take to training. Some batches are easier than others." Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same package of coffee, and Abigail jerked back as though burned. "Sorry," she murmured. Ethan studied her for a moment. "You know, for someone who's so comfortable talking about books, you seem mighty uncomfortable with people." The blunt observation caught her off guard. "I'm not uncomfortable with people," she protested, then sighed. "I'm just used to keeping my distance." "Why's that?" Abigail gave him an incredulous look. "Mr. Elliott, I'm sure you're observant enough to answer that question yourself." His blue eyes held her steadily. "Because you're a big woman, you mean?" The directness of his statement made her flinch, but also, strangely, relaxed something inside her. No euphemisms, no dancing around the obvious, just a simple acknowledgement of reality. "Yes," she said quietly. "People tend to judge rather quickly based on appearances." "People are fools, then," he replied matter-of-factly, returning to his task of organizing supplies. "Size tells you nothing important about a person." The simple statement, delivered without any special emphasis, affected Abigail more deeply than flowery compliments or false reassurances might have. She turned away, blinking rapidly. "These should go in your saddlebags," she said after a moment, indicating the smaller items. "The rest will need to be packed on your pack horse." They worked in companionable silence after that, and Abigail gradually relaxed. There was something calming about Ethan's presence. He moved deliberately, without wasted motion, and seemed comfortable with quiet in a way few people were. When they finished, he stepped back to survey their work. "Couldn't have done better myself," he said with satisfaction. "I'm obliged to you, Miss Turner." "You're welcome," she replied. "I hope your journey goes smoothly." He hesitated, seeming on the verge of saying something more, then simply nodded. "Good day to you, then." Abigail watched from the doorway as he secured his supplies to his pack horse, mounted his paint, and rode north out of Sweetwater. She told herself the hollow feeling in her chest was nothing more than the usual loneliness, temporarily heightened by a brief connection that meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. 2 months passed. Winter maintained its grip on Sweetwater Valley, though February brought occasional days of brilliant sunshine that hinted at spring's eventual arrival. Abigail continued her routine, opening the store, managing inventory, keeping the books, reading by lamplight in the evenings. She tried not to think about Ethan Elliott, but found him intruding on her thoughts at odd moments. Sometimes she imagined conversations they might have about books she'd read recently, or wondered what he would think of certain passages that particularly moved her. Foolishness, she scolded herself. One civil conversation didn't constitute friendship, let alone anything more. The bell above the shop door jangled one afternoon as Abigail was arranging a new shipment of fabric. She turned, expecting Mrs. Wilson, who'd ordered calico for a new dress, and instead found herself face to face with Ethan Elliott. He looked leaner than before, his face more weathered from weeks spent outdoors in the harsh winter conditions. A healing cut crossed his left cheekbone and his right hand was wrapped in a bandage. "Mr. Elliott," she said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "You're back." "Got back yesterday," he confirmed, removing his hat. "Thought I'd stop by to restock before heading out again." "Of course." Abigail smoothed her apron, trying to regain her composure. "What do you need?" He listed several items: coffee, sugar, ammunition for his rifle, tobacco, all practical necessities. As she gathered them, he wandered the store, examining new merchandise that had arrived during his absence. "How was your time at the outpost?" she asked, trying for casual conversation. "Productive," he replied. "Broke 17 horses for the cavalry, tough work but satisfying." He flexed his bandaged hand. "Got this when one of them took exception to the saddle. Looks painful, had worse." He shrugged it off. "How have things been here?" "Quiet," she answered truthfully. "Winter in Sweetwater isn't exactly eventful. A smile tugged at his mouth. Read anything good while I was gone? The simple question shouldn't have warmed her as it did. Actually, yes. A new shipment came from back east, included a collection of Mr. Twain's stories I hadn't seen before. His eyes lit with interest. Is that so? Any chance I could borrow it when you're done? The request caught her off guard. I suppose you could. I finished it last week. Much obliged, he said. I've been making do with an old copy of Shakespeare's sonnets for the past month. Know them by heart now. Abigail tried to picture this rugged cowboy reciting poetry by firelight and found the image oddly compelling. Which is your favorite? She asked. Sonnet 116, he answered without hesitation. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, she continued automatically, then stopped, embarrassed at having revealed her own familiarity with the love poem. Ethan's gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary. You know it. I know many of them, she admitted. Poetry speaks to the soul in ways ordinary language can't. The bell jangled again and Sheriff Miller entered, stamping snow from his boots. He nodded to Abigail before addressing Ethan. Heard you were back in town, Elliott. Any trouble at the outpost? Nothing unusual, Ethan replied. Lieutenant Jenkins sends his regards. The sheriff grunted. That boy still green behind the ears, learning fast, Ethan said diplomatically. As the men conversed, Abigail finished gathering Ethan's supplies. She could feel the sheriff's curious glance between them, and new rumors would soon follow. A woman like her conversing easily with a man like Ethan was bound to raise eyebrows. After the sheriff left with his tobacco, Ethan turned back to her. About that book. I'll fetch it for you, she said, grateful for the excuse to retreat to the back room where she kept her small collection of novels. When she returned with Twain's stories, Ethan had already paid her father for his supplies. Here, she said, offering the book. It's nothing fancy, but the stories are wonderful. Ethan took it carefully, as though it were something precious. I'll return it before I leave town again. When will that be? The question slipped out unbidden. Not sure yet, he replied. Need to rest up a bit, let this hand heal. Then I've got some business to attend to at the Harrison Ranch. Well, she said, suddenly awkward, enjoy the book. He tucked it inside his coat with a nod. I expect I will. He hesitated, then added, perhaps when I return it we might discuss it. Over tea or coffee, maybe. Abigail stared at him, certain she'd misheard. I beg your pardon, tea, he repeated, or coffee, whichever you prefer, to discuss the book. With me. She clarified, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. Something like hurt flashed across his features. Is that so surprising? Frankly, yes, she said honestly. People don't generally seek out my company for social occasions, Mr. Elliott. Then people are missing out, he said simply. What do you say? Week from today? Unless you'd rather not. Abigail hesitated. Every instinct warned her this was a mistake, that opening herself to this kind of interaction would only lead to pain. Yet something about the straightforward way he asked, without artifice or hidden motives, made her want to say yes. A week from today, she agreed finally. But here at the store after closing. My father would have my head if I went gallivanting around town unchaperoned. Ethan's mouth quirked. Wouldn't dream of compromising your reputation, Miss Turner. He tipped his hat. Until then. After he left, Abigail stood frozen behind the counter, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had Ethan Elliott really just asked to spend time with her, and had she actually accepted? Her father emerged from the storeroom. Was that Elliott I heard? Yes, she replied distractedly. He bought supplies and borrowed my Twain collection. James raised his eyebrows. Did he now? Interesting fellow, that one. He's coming back next week, she continued, still processing the information herself. To return the book and have tea here after closing. Her father studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Well, I'll make sure to be scarce but nearby, proper but not intrusive. Pa, it's just tea and conversation about a book, she protested. Nothing more, of course, he agreed too quickly. Just tea. But as he turned away, Abigail caught the hint of a smile on his weathered face and her heart sank. Her father was reading too much into this, seeing possibilities where none existed. Ethan Elliott was probably just lonely for educated conversation after months at her remote outpost. Once he spent time in town again, he'd remember there were prettier, more suitable women available for his attention. The week passed with excruciating slowness. Abigail found herself growing increasingly anxious as the appointed day approached. Twice, she nearly sent word to Ethan canceling their arrangement, but pride stopped her. She refused to appear flustered by something as simple as a conversation over tea. The morning of their meeting, she rose early and subjected herself to a thorough scrubbing in the tin bathtub, washing her honey-brown hair until it shone. She selected her best dress, a dark blue wool with minimal adornment that her father had ordered from a catalog the previous Christmas. It wasn't fashionable by Eastern standards, but it was the finest thing she owned, altered by her own hand to accommodate her figure as flatteringly as possible. "You look lovely, Abby," her father said when she emerged from her room. "Blue suits you brings out your eyes." Abigail smoothed the fabric nervously. "It's just tea, Pa, no need to make a fuss," he smiled. "No fuss, but a woman's allowed to look her best regardless of the occasion." The day crawled by. Each time the bell jangled, Abigail's heart leaped, though she knew Ethan wouldn't arrive until after closing. She found herself making silly mistakes, miscounting change, forgetting where items were shelved, all symptoms of her distracted state. Finally, at 5 o'clock, she turned the sign to closed and began her usual end-of-day tasks. Her father, true to his word, retreated to their living quarters behind the store, close enough to maintain propriety but far enough to allow privacy. At 5:30, a knock sounded at the door. Abigail's stomach fluttered as she crossed to open it, finding Ethan standing on the boardwalk, hat in hand. He'd clearly made an effort for the occasion. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and he wore a clean shirt under his coat. "Evening, Miss Turner," he said, shifting slightly. Was it possible he was nervous too? "Hope I'm not too early." "Not at all," she replied, stepping back to let him enter. "Please come in." She'd prepared a small table near the stove, with tea already steeping in the pot and a plate of ginger cookies she'd baked that morning. It wasn't fancy, but it was the best she could manage under the circumstances. Ethan produced her book from inside his coat. "Enjoyed this tremendously," he said, handing it over. "Especially the celebrated jumping frog made me laugh out loud." "That's one of my favorites too," she admitted, setting the book aside. "Please sit down. Would you like tea?" He settled into the chair, looking slightly too large for the small table setting. "Tea would be fine, thank you." As she poured, Abigail was dismayed to see her hands trembling slightly. She never entertained guests, had never sat down for tea with a man who wasn't her father or the minister. The novelty of the situation left her feeling awkward and unsure. "I hope you take it plain," she said. "We have sugar but no milk, I'm afraid." "Plain is perfect," he assured her. "Developed the taste during my time in the Army. We were lucky to get tea at all, let alone with fixings." This gave her something to latch on to. "You served in the Army. I didn't know that." Ethan nodded, taking a careful sip from the steaming cup. 7 years. Joined up when I was 18, right after the war. Served mostly out west, Kansas, Nebraska, Dakota Territory." "Is that where you learned to work with horses?" Partly, he confirmed. Always had a way with them, even as a boy, but the army taught me discipline, how to train systematically. His blue eyes crinkled at the corners. Horses are honest creatures. They don't hide their feelings or pretend to be something they're not. Unlike people, Abigail observed quietly. Exactly unlike people, he agreed, holding her gaze. That's one reason I prefer them most days. Yet here you are, having tea with a person instead of a horse, she pointed out, a small smile tugging at her mouth. Ethan laughed, a warm, genuine sound that transformed his face. Horses are poor conversationalists, especially about literature, and they don't bake cookies. He reached for one of the ginger cookies, taking an appreciative bite. These are excellent, by the way. Thank you. The compliment pleased her more than it should have. My mother's recipe, one of the few things I have from her. You lost her young. His tone was gentle, free from pity. Abigail nodded. I was 8, typhoid fever. I'm sorry, he said simply. Lost my father when I was 12. Logging accident in Oregon Territory. Never easy, losing a parent before their time. The shared understanding created a moment of connection between them. Abigail found herself relaxing slightly, the initial awkwardness fading as they continued to discuss Twain's stories, then branched into other books they'd both read. I have to confess, Ethan said after their second cup of tea, I've been curious about something. Abigail tensed, waiting for the inevitable remark about her size, some question about how she'd become so large or whether she'd tried to reduce. Instead, he asked, how does someone with your obvious intelligence and love of learning end up in a small place like Sweetwater? You could be teaching in a proper school back east or working as a governess for a wealthy family. The question caught her completely off guard. I never considered leaving, she admitted. My father needs me here, and I'm not certain I'd be welcomed in those positions you mentioned. Because of your size, he stated matter-of-factly. She nodded, appreciating his directness. People have certain expectations about how a teacher or governess should look. I don't fit those expectations. Their loss, he said with a shrug, but I understand about staying for family. It's not always about what we want, is it? Before she could respond, the bell above the door jangled. Abigail turned in surprise. She was certain she'd locked it after Ethan arrived to find Martha Wilson and her daughter Sarah standing in the entrance, looking equally startled to find the store occupied. Oh, Martha exclaimed. I'm so sorry, Abigail. The door was unlocked, and I thought I know you're closed, but Sarah tore her Sunday dress, and we need fabric urgently for tomorrow. Her voice trailed off as she took in the tea setting and Ethan's presence. Her eyes widened slightly, darting between them with undisguised curiosity. Abigail rose quickly, smoothing her skirt. It's quite all right, Mrs. Wilson. We were just discussing a book Mr. Elliott borrowed. How? Intellectual, Martha replied, her tone making clear she believed nothing of the sort. Her gaze lingered on the cookies, the teapot, Abigail's best dress. We can come back tomorrow if we're interrupting. Not at all, Ethan said, standing. I should be on my way regardless. Got an early start tomorrow. He turned to Abigail. Thank you for the tea, Miss Turner, and the conversation. Both were most enjoyable. Abigail felt her cheeks warming under Martha's scrutiny. You're welcome, Mr. Elliott. After he left, Martha made a show of examining fabric while her daughter wandered the store. Well, she said finally, voice pitched low, that was certainly unexpected. You and Ethan Elliott. Taking tea together. As I said, we were discussing a book, Abigail replied stiffly. Martha's smile didn't reach her eyes. Of course, dear. Though I'd be careful if I were you. Men like Elliott handsome, unattached, they can be quite charming when they want something. And what exactly do you imagine he wants from me? Abigail asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. The older woman looked momentarily flustered. "Well, that is men have certain appetites, and sometimes they pursue women they wouldn't necessarily." She stopped, apparently realizing there was no delicate way to finish her thought. "Women they wouldn't marry, you mean," Abigail finished flatly. "Rest assured, Mrs. Wilson, I harbor no illusions about Mr. Elliott's intentions. We share an interest in literature, nothing more." Martha had the grace to look embarrassed. "I meant no offense, Abigail. I just worry. You're such a sweet girl and so innocent in the ways of men." Abigail bit her tongue to keep from responding sharply. Instead, she forced a smile. "Now about that fabric for Sarah's dress." By the time the Wilsons left, Abigail's good mood had evaporated. She knew exactly what would happen next by tomorrow morning. The entire town would be buzzing with the news that Abigail Turner had been caught entertaining Ethan Elliott after hours. The speculation would be merciless. Her father emerged from the back room after the door closed. "Everything all right? I heard voices." "Martha Wilson and Sarah stopped by for fabric," Abigail explained, gathering the teacups with more force than necessary. "They found Ethan and me having tea." James winced. "Ah." "Martha Wilson has the fastest tongue in 3 counties. By morning, half the town will believe I'm throwing myself at him, and the other half will think he's taking advantage of me." Abigail's voice cracked slightly. "This is exactly why I keep to myself, Pa." Her father wrapped a comforting arm around her shoulders. "People will talk regardless, Abby girl. You can't live your life worrying about wagging tongues." "Easy for you to say," she replied, leaning against him briefly before straightening. "You're not the one they're talking about." That night, lying in bed, Abigail replayed the tea with Ethan over and over in her mind. Before Martha's intrusion, she'd actually been enjoying herself. Ethan was easy to talk to, knowledgeable about literature, and seemed genuinely interested in her opinions. Not once had he made her feel self-conscious about her size, but Martha's insinuations gnawed at her. What if the woman was right? What if Ethan was merely amusing himself with her? Or worse, what if he had dishonorable intentions, assuming she'd be so grateful for male attention that she'd compromise her virtue? No, she decided firmly. Ethan Elliott didn't strike her as that sort of man. His interest in books seemed genuine, his conversation sincere. She was reading too much into a simple social call, just as the town gossips would. With that settled in her mind, she closed her eyes and tried to sleep, ignoring the small part of her that had, just for a moment, imagined something more. The next morning brought the expected consequences. Customers streamed into the store in unusual numbers for a Tuesday, most finding flimsy excuses to linger and observe Abigail. Some were bold enough to mention directly what they'd heard about her evening with Ethan Elliott. "Such a handsome man, Mrs. Peterson commented while purchasing buttons she clearly didn't need. "Though I always thought he'd set his sights on someone like Claire Henderson. You know, the banker's daughter, so petite and accomplished." "I wouldn't know about Mr. Elliott's sights, madam," Abigail replied evenly. "Will there be anything else?" By midday, she was exhausted from maintaining her composure in the face of increasingly transparent questions and comments. When her father suggested she take a break, she gratefully retreated to their living quarters, only to be interrupted by a knock at the back door. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Turner," he said, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" she asked, surprised to see him. "For putting you in an awkward position," he explained. "I've heard the talk around town today. Should have realized what might happen if we were seen together." Abigail sighed, stepping back to let him enter the small kitchen. "It's not your fault, Mr. Elliott. Small towns feed on gossip. If it wasn't this, they'd find something else to talk about. He remained standing, turning his hat in his hands. "Still, I never meant to cause you discomfort." "I know," she said softly. A moment of silence stretched between them before he spoke again. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he announced. "Got word the Army needs more horses broken at Fort Laramie. Could be gone a month or more." "I see," she replied, trying to ignore the disappointment that washed over her. "Well, I wish you safe travels." Ethan studied her face. "When I return, perhaps we could continue our discussions. Maybe you could recommend another book for me to take along." Despite her better judgment, Abigail found herself nodding. "I'd like that." A smile crossed his face, transforming his rugged features. "So would I, Miss Turner." He moved toward the door, then hesitated. "One more thing, do you write letters?" "Letters?" "Yes," he confirmed. "I thought perhaps, that is, if you were willing, we might correspond while I'm away, about books or whatever else might interest you." The request was so unexpected that Abigail could only stare at him for a moment. "You want to exchange letters? With me?" "Is that so surprising?" he asked, echoing his question from their previous conversation. "Yes," she answered honestly. "No one's ever asked to correspond with me before." His expression softened. "Then they've missed an opportunity for what I expect would be fascinating correspondence." Against all reason, against every protective instinct she'd developed over years of disappointment, Abigail felt herself warming to the idea. "All right, Mr. Elliott. I'd be pleased to write to you." "Ethan," he corrected. "If we're to be correspondents, you might as well use my given name." "Then you should call me Abigail," she replied, feeling strangely bold. "Abigail," he repeated as though testing the sound of it. "It suits you." He replaced his hat. "I'll send my first letter when I reach Fort Laramie." After he left, Abigail remained in the kitchen, trying to make sense of this new development. A correspondence with Ethan Elliott. It seemed like something from one of her novels, not her real life in Sweetwater. When she returned to the store, her father gave her a knowing look but said nothing. For once, Abigail was grateful for his restraint. True to his word, Ethan departed the next day. Abigail watched from the store window as he rode north, his pack horse loaded with supplies, his tall figure straight in the saddle. She told herself not to expect too much. Men made promises easily and broke them just as easily. Perhaps his talk of letters had been merely politeness, soon to be forgotten in the realities of life on the trail. 2 weeks later, Sheriff Miller stopped by the store. "Got something for you, Miss Turner," he said, producing a letter from his pocket. "Came in with the mail pouch from Fort Laramie." The envelope was addressed in a surprisingly neat hand. "Miss Abigail Turner, Turner's General Store, Sweetwater, Wyoming Territory." She accepted it with what she hoped was casual gratitude, though her heart hammered in her chest. "From Elliott, I reckon," the sheriff observed with a knowing smile. "Mentioned he might be writing to you." "Thank you for delivering it," she said, refusing to give him the satisfaction of confirming his assumption. She waited until the store was empty, before retreating to a quiet corner to read Ethan's letter. His writing was as straightforward as his speech, describing his journey to Fort Laramie, the new horses he was working with, and the book he was currently reading, a volume of poetry he'd purchased from a drummer passing through the fort. At the end, he wrote, "I find myself thinking of our conversations more often than is probably sensible. The men here have little interest in literature, and the officers discuss little beyond military matters and the Indian problem. I look forward to your reply, if you're still willing to correspond with a dusty horse trainer." Abigail read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and tucking it into her pocket. That evening, after closing the store, she sat at the small table in their kitchen and composed her response. She wrote about new books that had arrived in the store, the early signs of spring appearing in the valley, and her thoughts on the poetry he'd mentioned. She concluded, "Sweetwater seems unusually quiet since your departure, though perhaps that is merely my imagination. I find myself watching the northern road more often than is strictly necessary. Safe travels, and I look forward to your next letter." After sealing the envelope, she studied it uncertainly. Was she being too forward, too familiar? But Ethan had initiated this correspondence, had asked for her thoughts. Surely it was acceptable to respond in kind. The next day, she gave the letter to the mail carrier heading north, ignoring the raised eyebrows and knowing smile. Let people talk, she decided. For once, she would allow herself this small pleasure without worrying about town gossip. Over the next several weeks, their correspondence continued. Ethan's letters arrived every 10 days or so, each longer than the last. He wrote about the fort, the soldiers he encountered, the beautiful landscape of the high plains. He described sunsets and thunderstorms with surprising poetry, and recommended books he thought she might enjoy. Abigail wrote back with equal enthusiasm, sharing her thoughts on literature, describing the changes spring was bringing to Sweetwater, and occasionally including observations about the townspeople that made him laugh out loud, according to his responses. With each exchange, she found herself revealing more her dreams of someday seeing the ocean, her occasional frustration with small-town life, her memories of her mother. And Ethan responded in kind, sharing his childhood in Oregon Territory, his years in the Army, and his hope of someday having his own horse ranch. In her quieter moments, Abigail marveled at how easily they communicated on paper. Free from the physical presence that made her so self-conscious, she wrote without reservation, and he seemed to do the same. They developed a rapport that felt intimate despite the distance between them. Spring turned to summer. The snow in the mountains melted, turning creeks into rushing torrents before subsiding to their normal levels. Wildflowers carpeted the valley, and Sweetwater emerged from its winter hibernation with renewed energy. In late June, Ethan's letters mentioned his contract at Fort Laramie was nearing completion. "Expect to head back to Sweetwater within the fortnight," he wrote. "Find myself looking forward to it more than is perhaps wise." Abigail read those lines repeatedly, trying to decipher their meaning. Was he looking forward to returning to Sweetwater generally, or to seeing her specifically? And why would that be unwise? The uncertainty made her anxious. Their written correspondence had developed a warmth and openness that might not translate to face-to-face interaction. What if, upon seeing her again, Ethan remembered all the reasons why a man like him shouldn't associate with a woman like her? She confided her worries to her father one evening as they sat on the small porch behind their house. "Pa," she began hesitantly, "do you think I'm being foolish?" James looked up from his pipe. "About what specifically?" "About, Ethan, these letters." She twisted her hands in her lap. "What if I'm reading too much into them?" Her father considered the question carefully. "Do his letters suggest special regard? They're friendly," she admitted. "Sometimes, more than friendly, but that could mean anything." "Could," he agreed. "Or it could mean exactly what you're hoping it means." Abigail sighed. "A man like Ethan Elliott could have any woman in the territory, Pa. Why would he choose someone like me?" "Because he has sense," James replied firmly. "Because he sees what I've always seen, that you're worth 10 of those simpering girls who do nothing but worry about their appearances and gossip about others." She gave him a sad smile. "The world doesn't work that way, Pa. Men want pretty wives who can give them strong children. She gestured at her substantial form. "You're my daughter," he finished for her. "Smart as a whip, kind-hearted and beautiful in ways that matter. If Elliott can't see that, he's not worth your time." Abigail leaned over to kiss his weathered cheek. "You're biased," she said softly, "but thank you." In early July, word reached Sweetwater that Ethan Elliott was returning. He'd been spotted at a ranch 20 miles north, reportedly heading their way. Abigail found herself both anticipating and dreading his arrival, uncertain what it would mean for their unusual friendship. She was arranging fabric bolts when the bell above the door jangled. Looking up, she saw Ethan standing in the entrance, trail dust still clinging to his clothes, his hat in his hands. He looked thinner than when he'd left, his skin deeply tanned from months outdoors, but his blue eyes were as intense as ever. "Abigail," he said simply. Something in the way he said her name made her breath catch. "Ethan," she replied, setting aside the fabric. "Welcome back to Sweetwater." He took a step forward, then seemed to remember they weren't alone. Several customers browsed the store, all suddenly very interested in their shopping. "Thank you," he said more formally. "It's good to be back." An awkward silence fell between them, so different from the easy flow of their letters. Abigail felt her cheeks warming under his steady gaze. "Did you just arrive in town?" she asked finally. He nodded. "Came straight here," he admitted, then added hastily, "to restock supplies, of course." "Of course," she echoed, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest at the implication that he'd sought her out first thing. "What do you need?" As she helped him gather provisions, they maintained a careful distance, their conversation stilted and impersonal compared to the intimacy of their letters. The presence of other customers made anything more impossible. When his purchases were complete, Ethan hesitated. "I was wondering," he said, voice low, "if you might join me for dinner tomorrow evening at the hotel restaurant. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Abigail's pulse quickened. "Dinner in public?" "Yes," he confirmed. "Unless you'd rather not." The idea of dining with Ethan at Sweetwater's only restaurant where everyone would see them together made her stomach clench with anxiety. Yet she couldn't deny the part of her that desperately wanted to accept. "I'll need to ask my father," she said finally, "for propriety's sake." Ethan nodded, understanding. "Of course, 6 o'clock if you can make it." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Miss Turner." After he left, Abigail became aware of the curious stares from the remaining customers. Mrs. Peterson, who had overheard the exchange, approached the counter with poorly concealed excitement. "Dinner at the hotel," she said. My. Mr. Elliott seems quite taken with you, Abigail." "It's a simple meal between friends, Mrs. Peterson," Abigail replied, striving for a calm she didn't feel. "Nothing more." The woman's knowing smile suggested she believed otherwise. "If you say so, dear. Though I've never known a man to invite a woman to dinner at the hotel for a friendly meal." As expected, her father raised no objections to the dinner invitation. In fact, he seemed unreasonably pleased by the development. "About time he made his intentions clear," James said, nodding with satisfaction. "Pa, please," Abigail protested. "He hasn't made any intentions clear. He probably just wants to tell me about his time at Fort Laramie in person." Her father gave her a skeptical look. "Men don't invite women to dinner at the hotel to talk about army postings, Abby." Despite her attempts to remain pragmatic, Abigail found herself spending extra time on her appearance the following evening. She wore her blue dress again, with a cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother pinned at her throat. She arranged her hair more carefully than usual, twisting it into a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. "You look beautiful," her father said when she emerged from her room. "Truly beautiful, Abby girl." Abigail smoothed her skirts nervously. "It's just dinner, Pa." "Of course," he agreed, though his eyes twinkled. "Just dinner." The walk to the Sweetwater Hotel took barely 5 minutes, but it felt like the longest journey of Abigail's life. She was acutely aware of curtains twitching as she passed, of people pausing in their evening activities to watch her progress. By the time she reached the hotel's front steps, her hands were trembling. Ethan waited in the small lobby, dressed in what were clearly his best clothes, a dark suit that looked newly brushed, a clean white shirt, and a string tie. He trimmed his hair and beard and looked so handsome that Abigail momentarily lost her breath. His face brightened when he saw her. "You came," he said, as though he'd half expected her to change her mind. "I said I would," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. He offered his arm. "Shall we?" The hotel dining room was the closest thing Sweetwater had to fine dining white tablecloths, actual glassware instead of tin cups, and a menu that extended beyond the usual frontier fare of beans and salt pork. Tonight it was nearly full, and Abigail felt every eye turn toward them as Ethan escorted her to a table in the corner. The first few minutes were excruciating. Abigail could practically hear the whispers circulating around the room, could feel the stares boring into her back. She kept her eyes fixed on the menu, though the words swam before her. "Abigail," Ethan said quietly, "look at me." She raised her eyes reluctantly to meet his. "I know this is uncomfortable," he continued, "but I want you to know how much I've been looking forward to seeing you again." The simple statement, delivered with such sincerity, eased some of her tension. "I've looked forward to it too," she admitted, after they ordered roast beef for him. Chicken for her. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Your letters," he began, "they meant a great deal to me. More than I can properly express. As yours did to me," she replied softly. "I've never known anyone who understands books the way you do," he continued, "who thinks so deeply about things, who expresses herself so clearly on paper." Abigail felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "You're very kind." "Not kind," he corrected. "Honest. I've met a lot of people in my travels, Abigail. None of them compare to you." The declaration hung between them, loaded with implication. Abigail struggled to find an appropriate response, acutely aware of the attention they were attracting. "You mentioned something you wanted to discuss," she said finally, changing the subject. Ethan nodded, seeming to collect himself. "Yes. That is," he stopped as the waiter arrived with their food, waiting until they were alone again before continuing. "I've been offered a position." "A position?" she repeated, confused. "With the Henderson Ranch," he explained. "North of here. Luke Henderson wants me to manage his horse breeding program. It's good work, steady pay, with a small house on the property." "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity," Abigail said, ignoring the sinking feeling in her stomach. The Henderson Ranch was at least a day's ride from Sweetwater. Their correspondence would continue, perhaps, but their brief in-person interactions would become even rarer. "It is," Ethan agreed. "Except for one thing." He set down his fork, his expression serious. "It would take me away from Sweetwater, away from you." Abigail stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "From me, these past months," he continued, "writing to you, thinking about you. Abigail, I've never met anyone like you. Never felt this way about anyone before." Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "What are you saying, Ethan?" He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers. "I'm saying that I care for you, deeply. More than I should, perhaps, given how little time we've actually spent in each other's company. But I do." Abigail sat frozen, unable to process the words she was hearing. This couldn't be happening. Men like Ethan Elliott didn't declare feelings for women like her, not in public, not like this. "If you don't feel the same," he continued, misinterpreting her silence, "I understand completely." "I wouldn't presume to, no," she interrupted, finding her voice at last. That's not it. I don't understand why you would. That is, there are so many women who would. Ethan's brow furrowed. Who would what? Be more suitable, she finished in a near whisper. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Because of your size, you mean, she nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Abigail, he said gently, do you truly believe that matters to me? It should, she replied, forcing herself to look at him. You deserve someone, whole, someone who can give you healthy children, who won't embarrass you in public, Stop, he said firmly. Just stop. I don't want some imaginary suitable woman. I want you exactly as you are. The intensity in his voice made her breath catch. You can't mean that. I've never meant anything more in my life, he assured her. These months of writing to you, getting to know your mind, your heart, I couldn't care less what package they come in. Tears pricked at Abigail's eyes. People will talk. Let them, he said with a shrug. People always talk, doesn't make what they say worth listening to. Despite herself, Abigail smiled. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the most foolish. Probably both, he admitted with a crooked smile of his own. So, Miss Turner, what do you say? Would you consider allowing me to court you properly? With your father's permission, of course. The question hung between them, fraught with possibility. Abigail knew she should refuse for his sake if not her own. A relationship with her would subject him to the same whispers and stares that had followed her all her life. Yet the hope in his blue eyes made her heart ache with longing. Yes, she whispered before she could change her mind. I would like that very much. The smile that broke across Ethan's face was like sunrise after a long night. He reached across the table again, and this time, Abigail met his hand with her own. Neither of them noticed the stares anymore. Summer passed in a blur of happiness Abigail had never dared imagine. True to his word, Ethan sought James Turner's permission to court his daughter, a formality her father granted with poorly concealed delight. Knew he was a man of sense, James commented afterward. Could see it in his eyes the first time he came into the store. Sweetwater's reaction to their courtship was predictably mixed. Some, like Mrs. Peterson, expressed thinly veiled disbelief that a man like Ethan would choose Abigail. Others, particularly those who had known her longest, seemed genuinely pleased for her. Martha Wilson summed up the prevailing attitude when she stopped by the store one afternoon. Well, it's certainly unusual, but Mr. Elliott seems sincere enough. And you've always been such a sweet girl, Abigail. Perhaps there's hope for all of us after all. Abigail had simply smiled, refusing to let such backhanded compliments diminish her happiness. For his part, Ethan seemed oblivious to the town's reaction. He visited the store daily, often bringing small gifts, wildflowers, a ribbon for her hair, once a book of poetry he'd ridden all the way to Cheyenne to purchase. On Sundays, they sat together in church, his tall form beside her substantial one, both ignoring the curious glances. In the evenings, they walked along Sweetwater Creek, talking for hours about books and dreams, their pasts and their hopes for the future. Ethan spoke of his desire for his own ranch someday, with fine horses and enough land to support a family. Abigail shared her wish to open a proper library in Sweetwater, a place where everyone could access the books she'd always found so transformative. As July turned to August, Ethan received word that Luke Henderson needed an answer about the ranch position. One evening, as they sat on the porch behind the store, he brought up the subject. Henderson's getting impatient, he said. Needs to know if I'm taking the job. Abigail nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. It's a wonderful opportunity, Ethan. You should accept. He studied her face in the fading light. It would mean living at the ranch, away from Sweetwater, away from you. I know, she said softly. Unless, he continued, his voice suddenly uncertain, unless you were to come with me. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" Ethan took her hand in his. "I'm saying, Abigail Turner, that I love you. I love your mind, your heart, your gentle spirit. I love the way you see the world, the way you understand things others miss. I love everything about you." Tears welled in her eyes. "Ethan." "I know it's soon," he rushed on. "Too soon, maybe, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He squeezed her hand. "Will you marry me, Abigail? Will you come with me to the Henderson Ranch, be my wife, build a life together?" For a moment, Abigail couldn't speak. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to seize this chance at happiness she'd never thought possible. But another part held back, protective instincts honed by years of disappointment urging caution. "Are you sure?" she asked finally. "Really sure?" "Because once we're married, there's no going back. If you change your mind, if you realize that being with someone like me isn't what you wanted—" "I won't," he interrupted firmly. "Change my mind, that is. I know exactly what I want, Abigail, who I want. It's you. It's been you since that first day in the store when you talked about books with such passion. But my size," she pressed, "the difficulty I might have bearing children. The way people will always look at us, always whisper." Ethan leaned forward and for the first time pressed his lips gently against hers. The kiss was brief but tender, a promise sealed in the growing darkness. "None of that matters," he said as he pulled away. "Not to me." In that moment, looking into his earnest blue eyes, Abigail finally believed him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding took place in early September, a small ceremony in Sweetwater's modest church. Abigail wore a dress of ivory silk her father had specially ordered from Chicago, altered by her own skilled hands to fit her figure as flatteringly as possible. Ethan stood tall and proud beside her, his voice steady as he promised to love and cherish her for all his days. The entire town turned out for the occasion, curiosity overcoming even the most disapproving attitudes. As they emerged from the church into the bright autumn sunshine, rice and good wishes rained down upon them. "Never thought I'd see the day," Mrs. Peterson was overheard remarking to her husband. "But they do look happy, don't they?" They spent their wedding night at the Sweetwater Hotel before departing the next morning for the Henderson Ranch. Luke Henderson had offered them the use of a small but comfortable house on the property, newly built and waiting for its first occupants. "It's nothing fancy," Ethan cautioned as they approached the simple wooden structure nestled against a stand of cottonwoods. "But it's ours, at least for now." Abigail smiled up at him from the wagon seat. "It's perfect." He lifted her down with strong, gentle hands, then swept her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Elliott." The name still felt new and wonderful to her ears. "Home," she repeated softly. "Yes, I think it is." Life at the Henderson Ranch quickly developed its own rhythm. Ethan left each morning to work with the horses, returning at midday for a simple meal before heading back out until sunset. Abigail kept house, planted a small vegetable garden, and began to make friends with the other women on the ranch, wives of cowhands and ranch workers who, away from town gossip, judged her on her kindness and skills rather than her appearance. In the evenings, they would sit together on their small porch, reading aloud from their growing collection of books or simply talking about their days. Sometimes they would walk to the nearby creek, where Ethan was teaching Abigail to fish, an activity she'd never tried before. "You're a natural," he told her the first time she successfully landed a trout. "Must be those quick reflexes." Abigail laughed, flushed with success. "Or just beginner's luck." "Either way," he said, pulling her close, "I'm proud of you." Such simple words, yet they filled her with a warmth she'd never known before. All her life, Abigail had felt like a burden to her father, to the town, to herself. With Ethan, she felt valued, cherished, loved for exactly who she was. Winter came early that year, bringing snow and bitter cold by late October. Their small house proved snug and warm, the pot-bellied stove radiating heat as wind howled outside. On such nights, they would lie in bed wrapped in quilts in each other's arms, sharing whispered conversations and tender touches. "I never thought I could be this happy," Abigail confessed one such evening, her head resting on Ethan's chest. "Never imagined anyone could love me this way." He stroked her hair gently. "Then you vastly underestimated your worth, Mrs. Elliott, and my good sense in recognizing it." She smiled against his skin. "Perhaps I did." As winter deepened, Abigail began to suspect she might be expecting a child. Her monthly cycles had always been irregular, but when she missed 2 in a row and found herself nauseated each morning, she could no longer deny the possibility. She confided her suspicions to Ethan on a snowy December evening as they sat before the fire. "A baby," he repeated, his expression shifting from surprise to wonder. "Are you certain?" "Not entirely," she admitted, "but I think so. I've been feeling different." A slow smile spread across his face. "A baby," he said again, this time with unmistakable joy. "Our baby." Despite her own happiness, Abigail couldn't help voicing her fears. "I'm worried, Ethan. Women my size, there can be complications." He took her hands in his. "We'll be careful, get the best doctor we can find, take every precaution. And if something goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," he said firmly. "But if it does, we'll face it together, like we face everything." His confidence reassured her as it always did. Over the years, Abigail had built so many walls around her heart, had limited her expectations to avoid disappointment. Loving Ethan meant learning to hope again, to believe in possibilities she'd long since abandoned. In January, they made the journey to Cheyenne to consult a proper doctor. Despite the cold and the difficult travel, Ethan insisted on the best medical care available. The doctor confirmed Abigail's pregnancy and, while warning of potential difficulties, seemed optimistic about her chances for a healthy delivery. "Strong heart, good lungs," he pronounced after examining her. "Just take care not to overexert yourself, Mrs. Elliott. And I'd recommend you come to Cheyenne for the delivery, where we have better facilities." As spring approached, Abigail's body changed to accommodate the growing child within her. Her substantial form actually proved advantageous in some ways. The pregnancy didn't show as early as it might have on a slimmer woman, allowing her more freedom of movement and activity. Ethan treated her with tender care, taking on more household chores and insisting she rest regularly. In the evenings, he would read aloud to her and the baby, his deep voice rumbling through poems and stories as his hand rested protectively on her rounded belly. "Feel that," Abigail said one night as the baby kicked vigorously during Ethan's reading of The Raven. "I think he approves of Mr. Poe." Ethan grinned, pressing his palm more firmly against the movement. "Or she's protesting. Hard to tell with poetry that dark." They had decided not to guess the baby's gender, content to wait for the surprise. But they discussed names endlessly. James after her father if it was a boy, perhaps Margaret after Ethan's mother if it was a girl. As summer approached and Abigail's time grew nearer, they prepared to travel to Cheyenne for the birth. Luke Henderson, who had become a friend and supporter of their marriage, offered the use of his larger, more comfortable wagon for the journey. "Can't have Mrs. Elliott bouncing around in that old farm wagon of yours," he told Ethan gruffly. "Not in her condition." The journey took 3 days, with frequent stops to allow Abigail to stretch and rest. They arrived in Cheyenne in early June, taking rooms at a boarding house recommended by the doctor for expectant mothers. Most of my patients stay here before their time comes, he explained during their first visit after arrival. Mrs. Watkins keeps a clean house and knows when to send for me. The wait was both interminable and fleeting. Abigail alternated between anxiety and anticipation, while Ethan remained steadfastly optimistic, his faith in her strength never wavering. "You're the most capable woman I've ever known," he told her one evening as they sat in their small room. "This baby is lucky to have you for a mother." On a sweltering day in late June, Abigail's labor began. Ethan stayed with her through the early stages, holding her hand and wiping her brow until Mrs. Watkins finally shooed him out. "Men are no use in the birthing room," the landlady declared. "Go wait downstairs with the other husbands." The labor was long and difficult, stretching through the night and into the following day. Abigail drew on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, her determination to meet her child giving her courage through the pain. Finally, as afternoon sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, her son was born a robust boy with a shock of dark hair, and when he finally opened them, his father's startlingly blue eyes. "A fine, strong lad," the doctor pronounced as he placed the swaddled infant in Abigail's arms. "You did well, Mrs. Elliott." Tears of joy streamed down Abigail's face as she gazed at her son. "He's perfect," she whispered. When Ethan was finally allowed to enter, his face pale with worry after the prolonged labor, he stopped short at the sight of Abigail holding their child. "We have a son," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "Come meet him." Ethan approached the bed cautiously, almost reverently. When Abigail placed the baby in his arms, his expression transformed with a love so profound it nearly broke her heart. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm your pa." He looked up at Abigail, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "He's beautiful, like his mother, James," she said softly. "James Ethan Elliott. If you agree," Ethan nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, cradling their son in one arm while his free hand found Abigail's. "Thank you," he said finally. "For him, for everything." They remained in Cheyenne for 2 weeks, allowing Abigail to regain her strength before the journey back to the ranch. Little James proved to be a good-natured baby, nursing well and sleeping for blessed stretches at night. When they finally returned home, they found their small house transformed. The women of the ranch had joined together to prepare a nursery in the spare room, complete with a handmade cradle, soft blankets, and tiny clothes sewn with care. "We wanted to surprise you," explained Sarah Jenkins, wife of one of the cowhands. "Every baby deserves a proper welcome." Abigail was overwhelmed by the gesture. She'd grown to like and respect the ranch women over the past year, but hadn't realized how fully they'd accepted her into their community. As summer turned to fall, Abigail settled into motherhood with the same determination she'd applied to every challenge in her life. James thrived under her care, growing plump and strong, his blue eyes tracking his parents' movements with increasing awareness. Ethan proved to be a devoted father, often carrying James with him around the ranch when his duties allowed, proudly showing off his son to anyone who would look. In the evenings, he would take the baby from Abigail's tired arms, walking him to sleep while singing old trail songs in his deep baritone. One crisp October evening, as they sat together on their porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson, Ethan turned to his wife with a serious expression. "I've been thinking," he began, shifting James to his other shoulder where the baby slept peacefully. "About our future." Abigail felt a momentary flicker of anxiety. "Oh, Luke's offered me a partnership," he explained. "A small share of the horse breeding operation with the chance to buy more over time." "That's wonderful," she said sincerely. You've earned his trust. It is, Ethan agreed. But I'm thinking longer term, about our own place someday. Abigail studied his face in the fading light. Our own ranch, he nodded, his expression earnest. There's land available west of here in the foothills. Good water, sheltered pasture, perfect for horses. It sounds lovely, she said cautiously. But can we afford it? Not yet, he admitted. But in a few years, if I take Luke's offer, save what we can, it could be possible, Abigail. Our own land, our own home. A place for James to grow up, maybe alongside brothers and sisters. The dream he painted was so vivid, so appealing that Abigail allowed herself to imagine it. A proper house with a big kitchen, bookshelves lining the walls, children running through rooms filled with laughter and love. I'd like that, she said softly. Very much. Ethan leaned over to kiss her gently. Then that's what we'll work toward, together. As darkness fell around them, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Just 2 years earlier, she had been the lonely, overlooked daughter of Sweetwater's storekeeper, a woman who expected nothing from life beyond books and solitude. Now she was a wife, a mother, a woman with dreams and a future bright with possibility. All because one man had seen beyond her size to the person within. I love you, she whispered, resting her head against Ethan's shoulder, more than I ever thought possible. And I love you, he replied, his arm tightening around her. Always will, Abigail Elliott, always will. 5 years later, on a warm spring day, Abigail stood on the porch of their new ranch house, watching as Ethan taught 6-year-old James to ride his first pony. The boy sat straight and proud in the small saddle, his father's hand steady on the reins as they circled the corral. Careful now, Ethan called. That's it, son. You're doing fine. From inside the house came the sound of 3-year-old Margaret singing to herself as she played with her wooden blocks. The baby, Thomas, slept in his cradle nearby, his afternoon nap a blessed respite for Abigail. The ranch was small by Wyoming standards, just 300 acres, but it was theirs, paid for with years of hard work and careful saving. Elliott Horse Farm proclaimed the wooden sign Ethan had carved himself and erected at the entrance to their property. They had a dozen fine breeding mares, 3 stallions with excellent bloodlines, and a growing reputation for quality horses. Ethan handled the training and breeding program, while Abigail managed the household and the business accounts, her head for figures proving invaluable as they built their operation. And last year, to Abigail's delight, they had finally realized another dream. A small lending library in the nearby town of Pine Ridge, funded in part by their modest profits and housed in a corner of the general store. Once a week, Abigail rode into town to oversee the collection, helping neighbors select books and encouraging children to develop the love of reading that had sustained her through so many lonely years. Life wasn't perfect, of course. Abigail still struggled with her size at times, particularly after each pregnancy when the weight seemed more difficult to manage. There were still occasional looks and whispers when they traveled to larger towns, people who couldn't understand what a handsome man like Ethan saw in a woman of her proportions. But those moments mattered less and less as the years passed, overshadowed by the deep, abiding love they shared and the family they were building together. Ethan remained as devoted as he'd been on their wedding day, his blue eyes still lighting up when she entered a room, his hand still reaching for hers in quiet moments of connection. As James completed another circuit of the corral, his confidence visibly growing, he called out, "Look, Ma." "I'm riding." "I see, sweetheart," she called back. "You're doing wonderfully." Ethan glanced up at her, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes, now lined with sun and laughter. In that moment, Abigail felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. For this man, these children, this life she'd never dared to dream was possible. She had expected nothing, believing herself unworthy of love because of her size. Ethan had given her everything not despite who she was, but because of it. And in doing so, he had taught her what love truly meant. Seeing past the surface to the heart beneath, valuing the whole person, building a life based on shared dreams and mutual respect. As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the ranch in golden light, Ethan led James and the pony toward the house. The boy was chattering excitedly about his riding lesson, while his father listened with obvious pride. "Did you see me, Ma?" James asked as they reached the porch. "Pa says I'm a natural horseman." "I did see," Abigail confirmed, ruffling his dark hair. "Your father should know he's the best horse trainer in Wyoming." Ethan grinned, stepping up to join her on the porch. High praise from a discerning woman. He slipped an arm around her substantial waist, pulling her close to press a kiss against her temple. "Though I'd argue my greatest achievement wasn't with horses at all." "Oh," she asked, though she knew what he would say. "It was convincing the smartest, most beautiful woman in the territory to marry me," he replied, his voice warm with sincerity even after all these years. "Everything else pales in comparison." James made a face. "You two are always saying mushy things." Abigail laughed, reaching out to include her son in their embrace. "That's what happens when people love each other, James. You'll understand someday." As they stood together on the porch of the home they'd built, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of purple and gold, Abigail felt complete in a way she'd once believed impossible. Her body, which she'd seen for so many years as a limitation, had borne 3 healthy children. Her mind, which had once escaped into books to avoid loneliness, now shared those stories with her family and community. And her heart, which had been so carefully guarded, now gave and received love freely, without fear or reservation. The Obese girl from Sweetwater had found what she never expected. A man who saw her true worth, children who brought meaning to her days, and a life filled with purpose and joy. She had learned at last what love truly meant, not fantasy or infatuation, but partnership, acceptance, and the daily choice to build something beautiful together. And in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the family that was her greatest blessing, Abigail Turner Elliott knew herself to be, quite simply, happy.